Hello. I think that there can be no better feeling than immersing yourself in a great big book, a multi-generational saga, or an expansive masterpiece, an epic story that you can just completely lose yourself in. But I also know how intimidating it can be to start reading a book because we know what a huge time commitment it can be, and there is no worse feeling than committing to reading a book for days or weeks or months and finding that book lacking. And sometimes I think we can even cut a book slack because we want to feel like we didn't waste our time. The great E.M. Forster once said about big books that long books, when read, are usually overpraised because the reader wishes to convince others and himself that he has not wasted his time. But I think also conversely, if we fall in love with a long book, we can be so glad that there are hundreds of more pages to read and enjoy in that book. So I want to recommend to you some really big books that I think are worth your time and justify the length of their stories. So recently, the Booker Prize commissioned me to write an article suggesting 12 of the best big books from the Booker Prize library, and I have them all here, so I thought I would share them all with you, discuss each of these books, why I think each of them are so special and why they are so interesting for being such long books. Now, how do I define a big book? I would call any book that is longer than 500 pages a big book. To me, that is a real doorstopper that is going to demand a lot of your time. And some of these books go to even more lengths, are double that, run to many more hundreds of pages than that, but they are all over 500 pages long. Now, I've not included in this group of books a couple of books from the Booker Prize Library that I would also recommend, A Little Life and A Brief History of Seven Killings, because I talked about these books more recently, and but I do think that they're worth reading, and also I enjoy the irony of their titles, which make them sound small, but both run to many hundreds and hundreds of pages. So I'm going to talk through all of the rest of the books in this pile. I'm going through each of them individually. I did try to lift them all up before, and I almost broke my arms picking them all up. Now, first there is Ducks Newburyport by Lucy Ellmann, which is one of my personal favorite books from recent years. And it was funny, at the Booker Prize ceremony, Lucy Ellmann was presented on stage with this special edition of her novel, and she kind of feigned her arm breaking as she tried to lift the book, and how weighty it was. And there has been so much commentary about how gigantic and sizable this novel is, because it runs to over 1,000 pages. It is one of the longest books to have ever been listed for the Booker Prize. But I loved it so much. It is such a wonderful story, recording in just a few days in the life of an American woman who has her own home baking business. She's also a very busy wife and mother, and we follow her thoughts in this long, continuous stream. It is not all one sentence, as some people claim about this book. It is multiple sentences, but they do run on because we follow her circular thoughts going through everything that is going through her mind throughout the day. And you will know pretty early on when you start reading this book whether you get on with the style or not, because it continues on in the same style throughout the entire book. But if you enjoy it, if you get into the voice, this wonderful comic and absurd voice, but is also making all of these wonderful critiques of the society around her, of expectations that are placed on women, but also these little snippets of like film dialogue that go through her mind, or song lyrics that just kind of come into her head, and there are certain images that play upon her mind and she keeps coming back around to, and there's so much wonderful wordplay in this story, which makes it so fun to read, but I fully understand not everyone gets on with this story, and this novel does have a plot, even though it's just sort of following the thoughts of her everyday life. There is a plot that it gets to, which does become very suspenseful towards the end of the book, and there's also a side plot about a mountain lion, following this mountain lion's perspective, which gives an entire different view of motherhood, and it's so interesting how this is weaved into the story. So yeah, what a brilliant, great big epic story of our times, because this narrator, this woman at the center of the book, feels like the weight of the world is on her shoulders, and we can feel this so intensely throughout the story, and I think that's what makes this book so meaningful. But I just enjoyed the pleasure of the language play and all of the wordplay throughout this wonderful novel. Next we have a new to me novel that I only just read for the first time very recently, Earthly Powers by Anthony Burgess, who's an author probably most well known for his novel A Clockwork Orange, made into the classic film, but some people consider this great big epic his masterpiece. It was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 1980, and it follows the life of an 81-year-old man who, the beginning of the novel, he's living in Malta. He was born in England, but he's living there as a kind of tax haven, but also kind of in exile from his native country because he's gay. He's been persecuted through different periods of his life for his homosexuality and always felt somewhat estranged. Now, at the beginning of this novel, an archbishop comes to visit him and asks him if he can help in the process of canonization for a former pope who is his brother-in-law, who was his brother-in-law when he was still alive. And so we see this battle between his feeling of himself and his feelings towards religion, and the conflict between his homosexuality and religious beliefs. And this plays throughout the entire novel, but it's looking at how these two different men, this author, this aging author, and this former pope, are both men in positions of power, and it's how they wield and interpret and translate that power and exhibit that power in the world. But this novel, I should stress also, is very comic. It's very funny. At the beginning, there's a much younger man who is his secretary, but also his lover, who is very distempered, and they have these spats with each other. And we follow in a comical way him recollecting the events of his life, many of which are very funny, but there are also many very poignant moments as he's reflecting upon his queer identity. And he's never ashamed about being a gay man, but he recognizes how this creates like a conflict in the world, and experiences how this creates many different conflicts in the world. But there's also so much fun literary play in this novel as he encounters many famous artistic and literary figures from the past century, but also there are snippets in this novel which are fiction and drama that he writes, and he's kind of playing in different genres and modes in these little snippets of stories within this larger novel, and it's so funny how those play out and show such like a masterful use of craft, of fiction to do this. So yeah, this is a really surprising and wondrous and immersive story. There's also a novel which in and of itself might not be the longest book that I'm going to talk about here, but if you also count Wolf Hall alongside the next two books in Hilary Mantel's trilogy about Thomas Cromwell, these three books have a combined length of 2,009 pages, and all three books really are a piece. I mean, they are separate novels, they can be read separately, but I think to get the real full effect of this epic story, you really should read all three of them. Now, it took me quite a while to get to this. I had many stops and starts with Wolf Hall, and I know lots of other readers felt this way too. The way she portrays the society around the Henry VIII in England at that time. There is a lot of detail in here, which if you don't understand a lot about that period, it can be somewhat alienating at first, but the way she begins this novel and gets into Thomas Cromwell's life as this poor beaten boy who is really maligned and misjudged and underestimated, and how he goes on to be one of the most powerful people in England, working very closely with Henry VIII, where a lot of his predecessors failed, and navigating all of the complex politics of the royal court and the English government at that time. It's so interesting and gripping because we all know the history of Henry VIII and all of his wives, and so we follow that story, focusing mostly on the perspective of Thomas Cromwell, but it gives a entirely new view of that story and life at that time, but also the mechanics of power and how that works over a long period of time, but also to do with this specific period and very crucial period of English history. So I read up a bit around Wolf Hall and this period of time before going into reading it, and then once I got into it, I was so gripped and loved reading Bring Up the Bodies, and then the longest book in the trilogy, The Mirror and the Light. So this is such an epic story that is really worth your time. Paul Auster's great big epic novel 4321 is a book that's developed more poignancy for me the older I get and the more that I think about it. Now, we all may be familiar with the term the multiverse, which has been popularized by Marvel films, but it's really elegantly used in this story, which begins following a character in the early 1960s, and a big incident occurs, and then we see his life branch out in 4 different distinct directions, and how through just a little change of fate and coincidence in his early life would have steered his life in so many different directions. And Paul Auster has really excelled at exploring this element of chance throughout his fiction, but this novel is really his masterpiece, and where it all really comes together, and how he shows how it plays out in many different ways. And so we follow this single character's development through these different stories, and the novel alternates between these different paths, and sometimes there are intersections and overlap between the stories, and then other times there's goes in a completely different direction. And so it's, you know, this sense of that the smallest thing can change our lives in radical ways that we can never anticipate. And it doesn't only affect his life, but also the people around him. And I think most poignantly in the lives of his parents. Like, you can see how his father, if he succeeded in business, it might have minimized the chances for his mother to express herself. But if he failed in his business, she might have found independence on her own and ways of living a more fulfilling life. And it's so interesting as the older you get to think about how your life might have gone in all these different directions, and you can't dwell on it too long, otherwise you'll go a bit crazy. But it's so interesting how it plays out in this novel, and how he explores how this character interacts with the politics and the changing society around him at the time. Iris Murdoch is one of my all-time favorite authors, and this novel, A Fairly Honourable Defeat, I think is one of my favorite books by her, and it takes a lot of chutzpah to incorporate Shakespearean plots into your stories. So this novel is a little bit A Midsummer Night's Dream, a little bit Much Ado About Nothing, but it also draws in other Shakespearean references and classical references into this story, which is really modern. So this novel was first published in 1970, and the plot follows a group of friends and family members as a figure enters into their life named Julius King, and he acts as a kind of element of chaos, which mixes up the relationships between all of these different characters, and we see the fallout of that and how this plays out in different ways, and so she tests this idea of love, and how well we know the people that we are with, how much we can trust and rely upon them. Also notions to do with good and evil, when good can be seen as quite dull and boring, and evil can be seen as kind of exciting. So there's a lot of moral complexity to this story and how it plays out. And I think it's good to be in mind of the Shakespearean drama references in this story, because the plot plays out almost like a piece of theater. You could say it's really overblown and slightly unbelievable, but if you think about it in theatrical terms, when we go to see a play, we're aware that we're not actually watching this action play out. It's all on a stage, it's all fictional, but we suspend our disbelief because we get so involved in the characters. And I think the characters in this story are so complex and layered, especially two characters named Axel and Simon, who are a gay couple that have been together for a really long time. And Iris Murdoch is always excellent at really sympathetically portraying gay characters in her novel. And I think this couple is one of the most convincing gay couples I've read about in all of literature. There's a lot of layers to their relationship, and it's really interesting how their story plays out. And I love this recent edition of the novel. The Vintage Classics republished a number of her books with these new covers, which you could say are a bit too flowery, but the flowers and the print of this tie does tie into the plot of this story, so I think it completely makes sense. But yeah, she's a writer that is so intelligent, but also her stories are filled with so much emotion. Nobel Prize winning author Patrick White is also an author that is new to me recently, and this novel, The Vivisector, is the longest book that he ever wrote, and it's a story of an artist. We follow him from his childhood, born into very humble circumstances in a large family in Australia, but he meets this wealthy older couple who adopt him and take him into their households, partly to be a companion to their daughter, who has a physical ailment which impedes her. And we follow his development as an artist and how he begins to relate to people by kind of dissecting them and taking them apart. So always has this emotional distance from them. So he begins out, I feel as a very highly sympathetic character, but you grow to feel more critical of him over time as his relationships with people are disrupted by this barrier he puts between him and them to kind of coldly observe them, and what this says about the practice of art and the dedication required for art is so interesting, and plays out in a really fascinating way throughout this long story. But there are also so many vibrant characters that are introduced throughout the story that is really entertaining to read. The winner of the International Booker Prize last year was the novel Tomb of Sand by Geetanjali Shree, translated by Daisy Rockwell. And this great big novel, I feel like, is so daring and ballsy in some ways, because the protagonist of the novel is a woman named Ma, and she spends the first, I think, 175 pages of this novel turned away from her family and the other characters in this book, but also from us as readers. And she has just recently lost her husband, so she is in mourning. So she has decided, she's had it, she's not going to engage with other people. But then she's given this cane, which the people around her believe possesses magical qualities, and then she decides to embark on a journey to her homeland, to the place which is now known as Pakistan. And so she visits this place, but also considers her past and how her life was disrupted by partition, and we see the repercussions of that in a really meaningful way. And as she is exploring her past, she's contemplating all of these borders in our lives to do with nationhood and gender and sexuality and communities that draw up barriers between each other, and how really all of these borders that feel like they are really there are actually just all in our heads. They're just all in the language that we use and don't actually exist. And so actually real life is much more fluid and complex than how we articulate it in the words that we choose to define who we are and where we are and our relationships with other people. So there's this wonderful magnanimous quality to the story, and this older woman who is just breaking down and through all of these barriers, and I find that so exciting. There's so much wonderful wordplay in this novel, and but also like a really complex and interesting family story that plays out over the course of the book. It's really wondrous. And speaking of family stories, another great, wonderful family saga is Family Matters by Rohinton Mistry, and I love the play of this title, that this novel is all about matters to do with a particular family, but it's also asserting that families do matter. And this novel is also following a very old character who in this case is a widower, and he starts to have a number of physical ailments, and he needs to rely on his children who don't really want to make room for him in their lives to do with economic problems that they're having, but also personal problems that are occurring in their lives. And so it's so heartrending following his story and sort of being bounced around between these different family members and trying to find his own sense of importance in the world still. But it's also this great big wonderful portrait of modern day Bombay, which occurs throughout the story. And I just love how he explores all these different family connections throughout this story, which also does play out like a Shakespearean drama in some way. There's a bit of King Lear to this story, and the protagonist did also teach English literature, so he's aware of all of these references. Now, this novel was published in 2002, and all three of Rohinton Mistry's novels have been listed for the Booker Prize, but this is his most recent book. I don't know why he hasn't published anything since then. He's so highly regarded. So like me and other fans of his, we've been eagerly waiting for his next book, and hopefully he's been writing a great big epic book, because he is prone to writing really long novels. And one of the coolest novels that I can think of that was published almost exactly 2 decades ago is Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell, which is such a really ambitious tale, but David Mitchell handles it so well. So it's really 6 interconnected stories which play out over the course of the novel and which are nested within one another and cover a really long period of time, from the mid-19th century and a high seas adventure to a post-apocalyptic future, and we follow the stories progressively until it gets to the far future, and then the stories cascade back and we get to the end of each story, and each of the 6 stories, as we're introduced to them, they have cliffhangers to them. So as I was reading this, I couldn't wait to find out what happened in these stories, but then it moves on to an entirely new tale and an entirely new genre. So it's so ambitious what he does in this novel, but the end result is so satisfying and so meaningful. And the protagonist of each of the 6 stories, you could say, is the same character that's been reincarnated in different time periods and in different forms. Each of the characters have very different personalities to them, but they all have this birthmark which kind of connects them all to each other. So what he's saying overall in this tale, and where we're moving forward in a society kind of in an uneven way, is so interesting, but also so entertaining. How he utilizes all these different genres to tell equally satisfying tales in this really epic way. Another incredibly ambitious novel, which I feel is completely successful and so exciting to read, is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. This massive, you could call it a fantasy story, because it does involve magic and an alternative early 19th century history in England, but there is so much about this story which is so meaningful and impactful as well. So we follow the 2 main characters of the story that are the first practical magicians in England for centuries, and how they get drawn into and involved in the Napoleonic Wars, but also these larger magical battles which are occurring behind the scenes, and what this story says about our society. It makes so many interesting statements while telling this massive, like, fantastical tale, which is just a wonder to fall into. Now, I do love a great big family saga, and one of my favorites from recent years is The Eighth Life by Nino Haratischvili, translated by Charlotte Collins and Ruth Martin. Yes, it's a novel so long it required 2 translators, and I did an online conversation with both the author and the translators here on my channel, so I'll put a link below to my interview with them, because it's really interesting hearing them discuss this book, which is so immersive, following the story, beginning with a man in the country of Georgia that happens upon this hot chocolate recipe which is so irresistible that people can't help wanting more of it, and it grows into this really successful business, and we follow subsequent generations of his family as they become involved in all different levels of society throughout Europe. And so it's this look at the 20th century and the different wars and different changes in society, but through these different really interesting family members over time, and their connections with each other, and how some of them lose touch with each other, and how it follows this story, and how this hot chocolate recipe is supposedly cursed. It's so fascinating how it plays out throughout the course of this great big epic, which is so satisfying and has so many wonderful individual scenes to it, and characters with so much depth to them, who are so compelling, that I just love how this family branches out and we follow their story over such a long period of time. And finally, the last book I want to recommend is the great big epic, The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton, who really made history in that she was the youngest winner of the Booker Prize, still is the youngest winner ever of the Booker Prize, and this is also the longest novel to have ever won the Booker Prize. And so this great big epic ambitious story follows a gold mining town in the mid 19th century in New Zealand, and a number of different characters and plot lines, and the story, as it progresses through different sections of the book, becomes increasingly shorter, and the tension amplifies over the course of the book. So the story has so much in it. There's greed and ambition and betrayal and secret identities and prostitution and drug use, and there are so many dramatic things to this tale, but also so many fascinating characters and how they play off from each other. And I was slightly intimidated at first because Eleanor Catton, in writing this novel, she based a number of the different characters on different signs from the astrological chart, but also different planets, and I don't know too much about all of that, so but I don't think that really matters. Like if you enjoy those things, you'll have another different layer of appreciation for this story, but if you don't, like, it doesn't really matter. But it's so interesting how the different characters play off from each other over time, and some of the characters that are my favorites are only introduced like midway throughout the book, so I kept discovering and falling in love with more characters as this story progresses, and it's such an impressive accomplishment, and it's such a meaningful book to me personally, because when I read this back when it was first published, I loved it so much and wanted to talk about it with other readers that it inspired me to actually start my book blog. That was almost exactly 10 years ago, and it just led me on this path of having all these online bookish interactions, and it's why I'm making this video today. So it's a very significant book for me personally, but also such a brilliant accomplishment that I just love this novel and this story so much, and I think it bears like rereading because it is so intricate. And I think with all of these novels, even though they are so long, I think they're all worth like reading again because there's so much in them, but they're also all worth reading all the way to the end, in my personal opinion. But I would love to hear what you think. Have you read any of these books? Do you think they justify their length, that they needed to be this long, or could they have been shorter? Or do you have any other really big books that you think are so worth the amount of time and the page number that they include? Please let me know about that in the comments below. But thank you for watching all of these suggestions. I'll put a link below to my Booker Prize article on their website if you want to check it out. But I hope you're doing well and reading good things and not being weighed down by a book that you feel like is way too long, because really our time is too short, and if you feel like a book is too long for you, well, then put it aside and pick up another book, because there might be some other big books that are more worthy of your time. But I hope you're doing well, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.